Hi everyone, welcome to Module 10. On this module, we will focus on differentiating instruction. So a few mini lecture goals for this module. We'll talk about differentiating instruction. Then I'll give a quick review about the disability investigation reflections for this coming week and our wrap up. So just to get started, in the last module, or actually a few modules ago, you submitted some video clips where you talked about, you shared examples from movies that you've watched or series that you all have been watching. And we kind of reflected on how the students or the individuals with disabilities in any of those clips or in those movies or series were represented. And then you reflected on to what extent those characters sort of match the descriptions that we've learned about in this course so far as they relate to specific disability categories. So I thought we'd open this up and just take a couple minutes to watch this quick clip from Forrest Gump. And then when you finish, we'll move on to this reflection. So this is an example reflection from a student from a couple years ago, and I just thought it was something good to kind of share, especially at this point in the semester, that helps us to really think deeply about how we conceptualize disability and some of the terminology that we use when we think about disability, and then what's appropriate to kind of embed in our conversations and how do we support families of students with disabilities. So you can see here how this student identified Forrest Gump, how they kind of characterized his needs and how reflected on how he was characterized in the movie. And I think these practical applications and experiences are really good ways to think about how you might move forward in your classrooms to support all learners. And so that's kind of been an ongoing theme in this class, is that you want to find ways to support all of your learners. And so this is one of my favorite lectures because differentiated instruction is one of the primary ways that we go about doing that. So what are some of the assumptions of differentiation? First, we know that students bring a multitude of varied and diverse experiences and strengths. They have different backgrounds, they have different learning needs, and they all bring these to the classroom, right? So no two of your students will look the same in terms of their background, their strengths, their needs. And we also know that students are able to acquire and apply basic knowledge at different rates and typically in different ways. So the ways that your students will learn, the way they will acquire knowledge and the way that they will demonstrate their knowledge will be through different modes. And you have to be able to adapt to their needs. And then third, we know that students learn at different rates and via different modalities. So we need to be able to accommodate those needs. And these are three basic assumptions of differentiation. So why is differentiated instruction important? We know that with differentiated instruction, you can employ a range of strategies that basically respond to the differences that students have in terms of their learning strengths and needs. Differentiated instruction also helps to engage students in the learning process, and then it challenges them to reach their goals. So when you're able to effectively differentiate your instruction, students learn that there is likely to be some degree of success after they've put in the work. For students who have not yet developed effective ways to learn on their own, they might need support for other ways to compensate. So this might be the case for students who have more significant either communication needs or cognitive needs. You will find accommodations such as technology or talker, or if it's related to their writing, maybe they use a computer to complete their assignments. You find other ways to compensate for those abilities that have not yet been developed so that they can continue to learn as independently as possible. So as you can see in the little figure here, students have, you'll have a classroom filled with students who have different needs, who come from different educational backgrounds, who have different language abilities and different rates of attention and interest, and come from different cultural backgrounds. And so you'll need to be able to support all of your students in those ways. Here's a quick clip of a video related to differentiated instruction, so take a peek at that. And then a second one that talks more about what exactly she gives a good example of how to differentiate instruction for your learners. So differentiated instruction can be via 3 different modes, right? One is content. So we can differentiate the content for your learners, meaning the actual materials and content that you expect that they are acquiring and learning. So that might be that they have a standard curriculum or a modified curriculum. You can also differentiate the process. So we think about that via the methods or the materials or the groupings that we use for students. So you might give them a student who struggles with handwriting, you might give them a pencil grip to do the same activities that the other students are doing. A student who has more significant needs might have a modified worksheet with just 6 math problems instead of the full 20 that the rest of the students have. And then the groupings, you might put together a group of students who, kind of balance each other in terms of their abilities. And all 3 of these process-related strategies reflect the differentiated instruction that you can embed in your classroom. And then finally, you can have a student evaluation. The product of your students' evaluations can also demonstrate your differentiation in the classroom. So one of the things we like to kind of get out of in terms of our old school thinking, if you will, is that sometimes many teachers have this notion of, well, like that's the way I've always taught, or that's the way I was taught, rather. And so you want to be sure that as you develop your own teaching and your own instructional practices, that you are making decisions based on what your students need in terms of their instruction, and not just on your personal preference, right? So it's like, well, my teacher taught me to do multiplication this way. Well, that worked for you, but it may not actually work for all of your learners. So you want to make sure you are providing instruction in a way that fits your students' needs and meets their needs most appropriately. We know that the key to quality teaching is knowing what techniques to use and when to use them and how to use them, and then how to actually determine if they're successful for your students. Because if they're not useful for your students, then there's no need to use them, right? And so this brings us back to that discussion we've had about collecting data and maintaining data and being able to determine if, in fact, our strategies are effective. So you can differentiate your instruction in a number of ways. You can redesign instruction in materials, and we'll talk through each of these. So universal design for learning, scaffolding, modeling, and reciprocal questioning are all methods of or modes of differentiation using instruction and materials. You can also use devices, and you can use modify your teaching and classroom routines as a way to differentiate. So when we think about universal design for learning, we need to first understand that not all of the curriculums are going to be a one-size-fits-all. There are going to be some materials and content that is not accessible for some learners. And so we need to develop a process of adjusting that material and adapting that material so that students who have different learning needs can still access the curriculum. So this means that you will have multiple means of representing the content. So the way you present it to them might be varied. So for some students, if you provide an example on the whiteboard for your class, maybe you also give learners who needed their own hard copy to see in front of them. You also will have multiple means of student expression of content. So you might typically request a choral response from all of your learners, but perhaps you have students who struggle with communication. Maybe they will use a whiteboard to hold up to reflect their response, to be able to demonstrate their expression of the content. And then you need to have flexible means of engagement as students learn. So again, this kind of goes back to the second point. For students who engage differently, you want to have a mode or method of engagement that matches their preferred method of engagement. So maybe it's hand raising, maybe it's writing their answer on a board or using a talker, etc. But you want to meet them where they are in terms of their preferred method and what we know is the best method for that particular learner. And again, that will look different across all of your students. So you can present material in a number of ways to engage in this differentiated instruction. For example, you might have prints, materials, or books on tape, or multisensory activities. And having multiple options for these materials allows students to select the method that best matches their learning style, if you will. Okay? So, what are some different ways that students can demonstrate their knowledge? You might have them write their answer on paper. You might have them develop a timeline of some sort. You could have them make a video like you all did for your disability investigations. You could have them make a PowerPoint. So giving the options for their demonstration of knowledge can be very useful so that students can kind of select the method that is best fitting for them. Similarly, students can engage in learning the content in a number of ways. So this might be through cooperative learning. It could be through peer teaching and peer tutoring, for example. They might use the internet as a tool. They might even play video games that embed some of the strategies that you're working on for that particular unit. Role playing. There are lots of ways that students can engage in learning the content, and you need to make these at least a few of these methods and modes available for them. And what happens is in many cases when students don't have content that has been modified or the tools or the accommodations that they need to be successful, their frustration results in behavior problems. And so we oftentimes hear teachers talking about, oh, I spend so much of my day just managing behavior, trying to get students to follow routines, et cetera, et cetera. But a lot of that really stems back to, or kind of goes back to, students' inability to participate effectively or to understand the content, which is then really a reflection of the extent to which we're making that content accessible for them, right? So you want to backtrack. When you start seeing those behavior problems, you really want to take a moment to look back and really get a clear understanding of why those behaviors are happening. And I'd be pretty confident in promising you that in many of those cases, it will result or be related to the student's sort of frustration with the content. Scaffolded instruction is another component of differentiated instruction. And with scaffolding, you essentially build your students' understanding through a dialogue, and you provide an opportunity to kind of discover. And your teachers often you basically question students about their thinking along the way. So you want to kind of see how students are learning and guide their learning instead of just throwing them in. So it's not throwing someone into a swimming pool and saying swim. It's providing them with each of the steps to be able to do so, right? So first teaching you how to float, and then how to kick, and then how to bring in your arms, and then the breathing, and then saying, okay, let's try it by yourself, right? So you serve as a guide for your student, and you provide prompting and support along the way. Modeling is also an excellent strategy for differentiation. You can provide think alouds that make the learning explicit for your students. You can also demonstrate how good thinkers think, and that's a really helpful thing for students because thinking is quite abstract, right? Like understanding how you think especially is quite complicated. So you could use graphic designers and kind of talk through your own thinking of, let's say, for example, you're working on describing a young adult book, right? And so you're using a graphic organizer to describe the characters in the plot. So if you can walk through your own comprehension and recall of the book using a graphic organizer, that is an excellent way to model such an activity for your students. Another strategy is reciprocal questioning. And with this strategy, students question each other about why certain events occurred. So you get a better understanding of what students think happened or why they think certain things happened, and it helps them to engage in peer learning process. Mutual learning also occurs because the students who ask the question also need to learn or know the answer. So it helps for that student who might be struggling to actually get the answer from the peer, and then to take turns and hopefully be successful in being able to answer a question of their own. Okay, So reciprocal questioning is another tool. All right, let's pause here and take a quick break if you'd like, and then we'll keep moving through the rest of our module. You can also use a number of devices that are helpful for differentiating instruction. You can use graphic devices, verbal and visual devices, and then memory devices. So some examples of graphic devices include things like a flow chart or another graphic kind of concept map or Venn diagrams, and these can really help to make more abstract concepts much more concrete for learners who are struggling with grasping that material. You can use diagrams or pictures that really help the students to understand not only the content, but the relationships between, let's say, for example, characters in a book, or the relationship between addition and multiplication, right? So really using multiple ways to tie in these multiple concepts for students. Here's a little bit more about ways that graphic organizers can be used and when they are appropriate to be used. So before, during, and after instruction. And then here's a slide on 4 stages for enabling students to develop their graphic organizer. So I'll let you read through that material. On this slide, we have 3 different types of graphic organizers and how you could use them. So you can look at these organization patterns, reading comprehension charts, and then story element examples. So an example organizer. And again, some additional examples of organizers. So if you're looking at cause and effect, you might use this type of organizer. If you're looking at a hierarchy, you might use this one. And if you're looking at problem solution, etc. So I believe this was in your text, so you should have access to this slide as well. Another cool tool is anticipation guides, and these are quite useful for students who struggle with anxiety, for students who really like to have a schedule and know what's going on. So you can not only help students to be prepared, but you can have pre and post guides that catch their interest, and then it gives them a reason for listening. So they have an understanding of what content is about to be explained, and it helps them to kind of stay focused as you go through. These are also helpful for students who have ADHD. And you can prompt the students to predict what might happen before, and then you might give them a column where they need to write some facts that they hear during, and then another column where they sort of respond to what actually happened during the story or during the activity. Another tool is using the planning think sheets. This can be part of the pre-writing to organize. So you want to think about who will read the paper, why are they writing the paper, what do I know about a topic, what do I want to write about this topic. So planning think sheets help students who struggle with that sort of cognitive overload during the writing activity. So having this as a tool to differentiate that instruction is super critical. So why are graphic organizers advantageous to teachers, right? One, they're a quick reference when presenting lessons. So you can kind of have that as a quick support. And over time, you can collect examples that you can reference not only for yourself, but for your students. 2, they're used to structure lesson notes in a way that makes sense to students. So especially if you're transitioning from a brainstorm to a narrative, having a graphic organizer for students is really, really helpful. 3, it helps in assessing your students' understanding. So if you have a student who really struggles with organizing their recall of events or recall of a story or comprehension, and you just say, all right, everyone, write in your journal about what happened in chapter 3 of our book for this week. For students who have disabilities, some of them, whether it be intellectual disability, whether it be autism, whether it be ADHD, that might be a really big ask and a really big task for them. So to differentiate that learning, you could provide your student with a graphic organizer in advance that helps them to write out who, what, when, where, why, how, etc. And then they're able to use their graphic organizer in the next step or the next activity, right? So having those can help your students. And then finally, you are able to observe their thinking process based on what you read as a class, as a group, or independently. So it can be at multiple levels of learning. So let's take a break here to just think of a text that you might be using in your placements right now, and pause and think about how you might use a graphic organizer as a tool to differentiate for both students with high incidence disabilities and students who are gifted learners. In our last module, as you will recall, we talked about gifted learners, right? And so it's very likely that you will have students who are gifted in your classroom alongside students who might have disabilities. And so it's important to think about ways that you would differentiate for a student who is a gifted learner and a student who might have a disability. So brainstorm some things there, and then we'll keep moving along. Memory devices are another helpful tool. You can use things like mnemonics or Roy G. Biv, if you remember. Things like that can be very helpful for students who struggle with, memorizing steps, strategies, content, etc. Teaching and classroom routines. You can also differentiate based on teaching and classroom routines. So one thing might be highlighting keywords or pointing out relationships. So, sequence of events in time, cause and effect, and these really help to aid students with their comprehension. You can construct study guides, so allowing your students to use a study guide. They put the page numbers for textbooks next to their sentences. Maybe they leave words out in the notes, but they put a list in the bottom of the page. Or maybe you leave out fewer words for some students, so you can adapt it based on your students' level of need. You can also teach them to use a study guide, right? So you might model how you would complete the guide and then have them do the same. You can use this as a homework assignment or even show students how to keep and organize guides over time. And especially if it's something where they need to have a cumulative study guide, you can model ways to kind of combine those and use it as a cumulative sort of support. Here are a few other considerations that you can see for study guides, and I believe you can look at an example of the Lexile Analyzer tool here, which is free for teachers. So take a look at that for sure. Communicating clearly in the classroom. This is one of the biggest ways to be successful in having a strong, differentiated classroom setting. So one, thinking about your writing. How can we deliver a clear message, right? How can I make sure my students understand what it is that I expect of them? And then two, giving your directions, being very clear in the commands that you are providing. You don't want to have too many directions or directions that are too long. And then you want to use keywords to get your learners' attention. You can also differentiate seat work. So students might have example problems either in small groups or with the whole class. You might write alternative sets of directions for students who have different needs. And then you might have students help each other with difficult directions as well. So you can set up seat work or environments in a way that helps your learners succeed. Here are a few strategies for or questions that help you to think about strategies for differentiating homework, right? So like, do students have this knowledge? Is the purpose of the assignment clear? Is there enough time given? And if your answer to these questions are no, then you want to go back and make sure that the homework is actually accessible. So pause here. We're going to do another quick activity. So think about a game that your students might play in your classroom. It can be a board game or, some sort of math game, science game, etc. Think about how you could prep the game in advance or differentiate it to make sure that all of the diverse learners can be included, okay? So think, for example, if you would need to create modified directions, if you would maybe even need to make your own version of a set of cards for some learners to use. You could think about whether you need to use prompts, create prompts for your students. Think about what you could do to differentiate the content, the materials, the instructions, so that all of your students could still play headbands or play Uno, okay? And then finally, as it relates to differentiation, we also always want to think about ways to partner with parents. So no matter what you're working on in your classroom, if it's differentiation, if it's accommodations, if you're thinking about modifications, if you're working on the least restrictive environment, if you're working on, teaching triple digit multiplication, right? No matter what you're working on in your setting, in your classroom, you always want to think about how you can partner with parents to help your students become more successful in that particular content or that unit or that lesson, right? And so there may be some reasons that parents cannot tutor, but you want to make sure that parents can be as involved as they can be, and you want to make sure that their level of involvement is not a reflection of sort of your commitment to partnering, right? Like, we know that sometimes parents are not as able to engage, or maybe there are certain factors that prohibit them from coming and visiting school, et cetera, et cetera. But you want to do the very best that you can as a teacher to engage parents successfully, to explain to them the strategies that you're using in the classroom for differentiation, and to see if maybe they can carry over some of those things in their activities at home, right? Many parents experience guilt and resentment and stress, and you don't want to have that kind of trickle down to the students who might also feel that resentment or pressure. But you really want to create opportunities to create carryover, to build rapport with families, and ultimately to create a space where the students are learning and successful as a result of your differentiated instruction. So finally, we have a reflection due this week, as we do every week. But I wanted to give a quick kind of update on the directions for this week, and a pause to give you all very good props, because I've glanced at your disability investigations, at least the ones that have been submitted to this point, and they really look awesome. So I just want to say hats off to all of you for doing such great work on your disability investigations, and I'm looking forward to watching all of those. So for this week, your job for your weekly reflection is to watch at least 2 presentations of your peers, your colleagues who are also in the course, and then complete the weekly reflection that's based on the disability presentations you watched. So in Moodle, as you always do when you go to submit your weekly reflection, the prompt there will ask you a few specific things about the presentations that you watched, and your job is just to reflect on those presentations, to talk about what you learned or what you might take away from there and apply to your classroom. So you can click on this shared folder that's here, linked here on the screen, to access all of the presentations. And I have tested out all of the ones that are there, and you should be able to open all of those even just in the Google Drive. Like, you don't necessarily need to download those. And in fact, I wouldn't recommend downloading them because it will take quite a while and maybe a good bit of space on your computer. So I would highly recommend just watching it in the Google Drive, and then maybe jotting down some notes while you watch, so that you're able to provide responses to your reflection prompt in Moodle. Okay.